Thank you. As chairman, I'd also like to introduce RS 0822. It's a bill concerning long-term funding of the Kansas Water Plan. Are there any other bill introductions? Seeing none, we'll move forward. We have an informational briefing this morning from Leo Henning, Director of Environment with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. Welcome, Director Henning.
Is it not working? Okay. Did you hear me? Okay. All right. So next slide. Just a brief overview of Department of Health and Environment. Secretary Stanek is the secretary at KDHE. Those boxes in the middle are the support functions for the agency. And then there's three main divisions within KDHE. First one is public health. The second one is Division of Environment. And then the third one is healthcare finance, which is the state Medicaid program. Next slide. Our agency mission is to protect and improve the health and environment of all Kansans. The way that the Division of Environment supports that mission is we provide or make sure that everyone has clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and clean soil to live on. So a little discussion here is I know you've heard informational briefings from other agencies, and one of the things that, if you could remember, is that if you break up the water issues in the state, there's really three organizations that handle them, which is the Kansas Water Office, which takes care of mostly the planning and coordination of the state water plan funding. Then you have the Department of Agriculture, Division of Water Resources, which deals mostly with water quantity issues. And then KDHE deals mostly with water quality issues. And so as we go through this, if you can just remember that we are the water quality agency, I think it will help. So next slide. So the Division of Environment implements these major federal environmental acts instead of the Environmental Protection Agency. The state has been delegated these programs from the EPA, but it doesn't mean that we can do what we want, right? EPA still reviews, audits, and makes sure that we are implementing those plans the way they were intended to be implemented. So just a real quick review, the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, those are both implemented by the Bureau of Water. The Clean Water Act basically deals with surface water and some groundwater issues. And then the safe drinking water is the water that you drink. The next one is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, which is a long word for Superfund. That's the federal Superfund program. It also, most of our state cleanup programs follow the same type of process as what's laid out in the Superfund program. And then that program and the state programs are in our Bureau of Environmental Remediation. The next one is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is basically your hazardous and solid waste rules and regulations. And the Bureau of Waste Management implements that. The Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, or SMCRA, that is for coal mining mostly down in southeast Kansas and is in our Bureau of Environmental Remediation. And then the final one there is the Clean Air Act, which is air quality and air emissions, and our Bureau of Air implements that. So the Division of Environment is a highly regulatory agency. We receive applications from a industry, usually. We provide technical review of those applications. We then issue permits. Once the permit is issued, we inspect the facility, make sure that they are in compliance with those permits, and we provide technical assistance to those facilities to ensure that they are trying to follow the rule. And if needed, at the end of the day, we will take enforcement actions if they are not in compliance and refuse to come into compliance. So that's the federal laws that we implement. Next one. And this is just a little cheat sheet for you. If you're ever interested in what bureaus do what things, you can come to this and kind of figure out if you have a question, what bureau you need to get a hold of if you have a question regarding any of those subjects that are listed there. Next one. So I'll start with the Bureau of Water. Like I said, Tom will cover many more of this in much more detail, but I'm going to give you a quick overview of the Bureau of Water. First thing is wastewater treatment and discharges from point sources. So if a facility has a effluent from their process that goes to either a surface water or a city treatment plant, we provide the permitting for either pre-treatment if it goes to a water treatment plant, or what we call an MPDS permit if it's being discharged to a stream. And those are all to make sure that that effluent is not impacting the stream quality. Drinking water system, again, we provide the oversight of all the drinking water systems in the state, making sure that they are in compliance with federal rules and that they are meeting the standards, the federal standards. Surface water quality, all streams in the state have a quality requirement, and so therefore we are out monitoring those streams to make sure those streams are meeting those, and when they are not meeting the standards, then we have a program called a TMDL program, which is a total maximum daily load program, which tries to bring those streams back into compliance by reducing load in different areas. And then the state revolving loan program is a low-interest loan program to municipalities for wastewater and drinking water systems. Next one. Here's just some pictures to show you kind of some of the water treatment plants and point discharges. These are the things that we permit, review, technical assistance, whether it's wastewater or drinking water, to make sure that the effluent from those systems meet water quality standards to where they're being discharged. Next slide. On the public drinking water systems, we have 979 PWS systems in the state. The graph on the left shows that most of the water systems serve less than 500 people. Over about 50% of the drinking water systems serve less than 500 people. And then on the right, it shows you the source of that water. And if you look at it, it basically shows you that half the water comes from groundwater and half the water comes from surface water. Next slide. And this is the state revolving loan program. It shows that we have executed $1.1 billion of loans for the drinking water systems in the state. And we've also executed $1.45 billion for wastewater treatment facilities in the state. Next slide. Okay, now I'm going to talk about our Bureau of Field Services a little bit. That's where our district office operations are, which is where our inspectors are. We have our inspectors out in the field, close to the facilities that they inspect, so that they can be close and also provide technical assistance to those facilities. They also are our emergency response folks. When there's an emergency or a spill or things like that, those are the people that go out. They're first on scene to try to remedy the situation. Also in the Bureau of Field Services is our feedlot program called Livestock Waste Management Section. There, they do the permitting and inspections of feedlots. The Watershed Restoration Protection Strategy Program is our non-point program, which is what I talked about earlier, were point sources where you have discharges out of a pipe into the stream. The non-point are not everything but that. So it's like runoff from fields. So it's just not a point, it's kind of a larger area. And then we have the Drinking Water Protection Agency, or Drinking Water Protection Program, which helps municipalities implement best management practices to reduce nitrates in the source water for their drinking water. So this is a program, it's a fairly new one, to try to lower nitrates in groundwater by implementing best management practices near their well fields. Next one. This is a depiction of our district offices. You can see the amount of staff that are in each district office there. And if you add up all those boxes, the Division of Environment has 443 staff. Next one. So, as I said, our district offices is our disaster response group also. And these are the type of activities they are involved with. Debris management, especially after an episode like a tornado or a flood, and we have lots of solid waste that needs to be taken care of. They'll be out there helping separate the materials so they can be appropriately disposed of. Spill cleanups. The picture on the right there is a picture from the TC oil spill I think everyone's talked about or heard about. It's just an example of a boom that you put across the stream to keep the oil behind it. And then that little thing up there on the left side of the picture is a skimmer, and they use that to pull the oil off the top of the water and put it into a truck to be disposed of. Livestock mortality, whenever we have a large animal kill, whether it's weather or disease related, we help make sure that those carcasses are disposed of in a proper manner. We provide the technical assistance to people that in those districts. And then we also respond to man-made disasters like fish kills and illegal dumps and things like that. Next one. So also any complaints that come into KDHE are routed out to the district offices for investigation. And in 22, we had 381 complaints that we responded to. And it ranges from everything you can possibly think about that comes to us as a complaint. We will run it down and make sure that there's no concern there. But illegal dumping, burning, odor, smell, runoff, septic tanks, all those different complaints that we get are the types of things that we go out and look at. Next one. This is just a picture of all of the permitted livestock facilities in the state, and just gives you an idea of where they are and at what concentrations. Next slide. And then this is a slide on our non-point source program, or RAPS program. It's a voluntary program for landowners to implement best management practices to reduce bacteria, chemical, and sediment impacts to streams from fields. The type of things that we implement are soil health activities, buffers, riparian corridors, stream bank stabilization, fencing for alternative drinking water sources for livestock. So those are just an idea of some of the things that this program does to try to keep what's on the field in the field. Next one. Next, I'll talk a little bit about our environmental remediation. That's where our underground and above ground storage tank program is. The picture there on the right is an underground storage tank being pulled out. Mostly gas stations, but it does have other tanks that are in the program, but probably 95% of them are underground and above-ground storage tanks at gas stations. The next one is the Superfund program, which is an EPA lead program, and then all the state programs for cleanup, which is, and examples would be the state response program, which is the same exact thing as the Superfund program, but it's state-run instead of the EPA run. And then we have other programs like the voluntary cleanup program, where a willing landowner wants to clean up their property, they can get into that program, and we'll provide oversight and closure of their site. The orphan site program, which is abandoned sites where there's no longer a responsible party to clean them up. The state oversees that program and actually implements cleanups at those orphan sites. We also have the federal facility program, which does oversight and cleanup at all the military and old military bases around the state. And then the dry cleaning program, which is a specific program to deal with just dry cleaning contamination, which has been an issue here in the state. We also have redevelopment programs to bring properties back into use that are blighted or have a stigma of being contaminated. We can run those through our brownfields program to help people regenerate those land properties and get those back on the tax roll. We also have tools to make that happen, which is things like the environmental use control program and the innocent landowner program, which is we issue a certificate of environmental release. So if you are not the person that caused the contamination on the property, you can be held harmless if you do buy that property or own that property. And then the last one on here is the surface mining restoration. Like I said, is the coal mining reclamation program down in southeast Kansas. And they deal with the acid mine drainage out of the old coal mines. And then emergency response actions for homes that are subsiding under coal mined areas. And then openings and shafts and subsidences from where the old shafts that open that used to go down into the mines. They come open every once in a while. And so we have a program to deal with those. We've had these mine shafts open up in playgrounds, in schools, and so it's we have to get out there fairly quickly to make sure that there's no injury there. Next slide is just some examples of what we see. The picture on the left is a baler, which is what we drop down a well to take a water sample. If you look at that kind of golden color there on the top of the water is about 8 inches of gasoline that is sitting on the top of the water table. So when we dropped it down there, that's how much gas came out with the water sample. The next one is an example of a mine shaft or subsidence that is opened up. We go in there, we concrete the bottom of them, and we fill them back up so that they don't ever open again. And then right side there is just an example of a dry cleaning plume that we have down in Hutchinson, Kansas. That groundwater plume is about 1.5 miles long. And when we discovered that site, all the people to the south of there were on their own private wells. So those people had been drinking contaminated water for many years. So one of the actions that we did was to hook all these people up to the potable drinking water system. So those are just examples of things that happen in the Bureau of Environmental Remediation. Last one I wanted to talk about is probably our most expensive site that we have in the state, which is the Cherokee County Superfund site. That is where historical mining practices for lead, cadmium, and zinc, in those days when they were done mining, they just left. And a lot of those companies are no longer around, so we had to give this to EPA to clean up because of the size and cost. But just an example of this is a before and after picture here of what it looked like before the remediation occurred. And then the picture on the right is what it looks like afterwards. So we take the ground that is pretty well non-useful, and we return it to a beneficial use to where the landowner can actually graze cattle and things like that on it. Next slide is Kansas Health and Environmental Laboratory. Just a quick update on that. The legislature did give us authority to build a new lab. It will be located at the corner of 12th and Topeka, across from the Blue Cross building on the northeast corner. You might see the fence has been put up around the parking lot there. We hope to break ground on that lab this, well, I can't say this month yet, but February, and with a completion date of December of 2024. So it's on schedule yet, even though we've had some issues with getting metal under contract. We still think we can make our December 24th done date. So the things that we do at the laboratory is we do environmental testing, sampling. About 95% of the state drinking water systems send their water samples to the lab for analytical work. Also, our surface monitoring group that goes around the state and takes surface water samples of streams. Most of their samples are completed there at the lab. And then there's a few, and I shouldn't say a few, but there's also, but in a less amount, of the environmental samples that like waste management, BER take out in the field, whether it's soil, groundwater, or surface water, they run those also for us. Also at the lab, where they do all the health testing for the state. And those things that they test for there are COVID, which is something that they have been very busy with over the last few years. Thankfully, those numbers have dropped off significantly. They also perform the newborn screening type work for every infant has to be tested when they are brought into the world to make sure that they are healthy. And if there's any concerns, that we address them immediately. So that's the newborn screening program. They also test things like influenza, tuberculosis, boy, that was a hard one. And then white powder, you know, if there's a white powder incident around the state, that all goes to the lab to figure out what it is. So also the breath alcohol program, that is a program that we run for law enforcement. We certify the breath alcohol instruments to certify that the instruments and the operator are trained in such a manner that if there's a DUI case, that any evidence brought into the courtroom that is admissible, and there's no question that what the results are good. And then the lab certification program is we have staff that go out to public, private labs that provide environmental testing or health testing and verify that those labs are following their protocols to make sure that the results that you're getting as a patient are good and that you can make decisions based on those results. So next one is waste management. Quickly, all of your landfills, whether it's a municipal, construction, and C&D landfill or industrial landfills, are permitted, inspected, and are in compliance. We also handle all the hazardous waste facilities in the state that are generating hazardous waste, and then those facilities that transport, store, and dispose of hazardous waste. Those are all in our Bureau of Waste Management. And then other things that the Bureau does is the composting facilities, recycling facilities, the county's household hazardous waste programs, and the waste tire program. They also help cities with illegal dumps, and there's a program where we will help a city if they find an illegal dump. We'll provide some financial aid to them to go clean that up. And then same with city dumps, the old city dumps that were pre-law. We have a program to help those cities repair their old city dumps if they need them. Next then, Bureau of Air. It's pretty simple. It's your air emissions. So we permit facilities to have emissions into the air. We make sure that their emissions are in compliance with the permits and enforcement actions if they're not. Also, the asbestos program is a training program to certify contractors who perform asbestos abatement. And then the lead program is a similar program, but it's for contractors that do lead paint abatements in residential settings. With that, I am going to stop talking about Division of Environment overview, and I'm going to allow Tom to come up and talk about some specific water issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Tom Stiles. I'm Director of Bureau of Water at Kansas Department of Health and Environment. The slide you have before you is almost a stream of conscious listing that we came up with quickly to say, here are the issues that are front and center right now that we're dealing with. And I'll do a quick touch on each of those, as well as mention one or two that are not on the list right now. Implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law has been a dominant task in our offices since last summer. It has brought in additional monies from EPA that go into our 2 state revolving loan funds. Those are used to finance water, wastewater, and stormwater projects that are sponsored by municipalities, rural water districts, sewer districts, et cetera. It's been in place both programs have been in place for a couple of decades. We view them as very, very successful in putting forth infrastructure improvements. Part of that is just to replace aging infrastructure, and part of that is to deal with compliance issues that have come about because of that aging infrastructure. There are, of course, as all things that are handed down from the federal government, there are strings and requirements attached that we continue to sort through and try to mitigate to make sure that the availability of these funds remains attractive to potential project sponsors and to utilize them. This time with the bipartisan law, Congress and the administration put forth 2 of their major priorities that they wanted to see accomplished, principally on the drinking water front. Whereas some of the allotments are utilized within our 2 SRFs to fund what we've typically done: treatment plants, water line extensions, sewer lift stations, et cetera. But there are also specific earmarked, I shouldn't use the word earmarked, but specifically dedicated funds for lead service line inventory and replacement, which is a priority of the administration to essentially get the lead out, all spurred by the actions and lack of action in response in Flint, Michigan, and then in subsequent other public water supply systems that have registered high levels of lead present within their drinking water. The administration has made removing all lead from both the utilities side of our water distribution systems, but also on the consumer side, a major priority. And the first step will be for these municipalities, public water supplies, rural water districts, to conduct inventories to see just where those lead service lines are. As a rule, we generally don't have much in the way of lead service lines. Ours tend to be more things like galvanized copper, et cetera. But there are a lot of fixtures and joints that have lead are either composed of lead or utilize lead solder that we're endeavoring to try to find and remove ultimately. The other emerging priority that has come forth from the federal government has been PFAS. It's the second item here. PFAS is what are known as the forever chemicals, long chain carbon compounds that are tied to fluoride. The carbon fluoride bond is one of the strongest bonds in nature, and by that very characteristic, they're almost impossible to break down. And so they have accumulated in all things, all media, including all of us, present within our bloodstreams. PFAS has been found now to be suspected as implicating health problems, potential carcinogenic issues, et cetera, and the federal government wants to start moving to get PFAS out of the system. It is a daunting task, starting with the fact that typically rainfall now contains PFAS at levels that are higher than what EPA is suggesting as appropriate health advisory levels there. In Kansas, because of our nature of being a predominantly rural state, PFAS was never a big issue because we just didn't have a lot of industrial complexes that were engaged in manufacturing or utilizing PFAS compounds, even though everything's got PFAS in it, from Scotchgard to Teflon to dental floss. So it's everywhere. The impetus has been to first focus on drinking water and try to get it set at a level where it basically is removed from as a source or a path of exposure for people, particularly children. We got into the game actually quite late. It has been more an issue on the coasts, particularly New England, as well as up in the northern tier states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, where companies such as 3M manufactured the PFAS for decades. Down here, our first task has been to go out and begin to sample for it. And that means our lab had to be stood up to be able to analyze for it. And then we've been engaging in a ramp up of monitoring of surface waters, streams and lakes, as well as selected wastewater plants to determine if PFAS was present. Bottom line, yep, it's there. We're seeing about 6 to 7 to 8 of the compounds present in our streams and certainly in our wastewater, but at levels that a casual observer would say are relatively low and not approaching anything in the manner of an acute concentration. But it's there, and the issue will come to where EPA decides to draw the line in terms of an acceptable concentration on these in these media and waters and waste streams there. That will ultimately define how big an issue PFAS will be for us. Right now, the suggested levels that came forth from EPA as originally as health advisories, but are working their way toward becoming maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, are quite low. If that's the case, then all drinking water supplies are going to have to figure out how to try to mitigate and lower and eliminate PFAS concentrations down to a non-detect level, in spite of the fact that some of the suggested EPA limits are actually below the detection level. They basically want it totally removed. From our perspective, if you can detect it, you're going to have to start thinking how to deal with it. So it's an ongoing effort. We have reinvigorated a task to work with about 120 public water supplies to voluntarily test their water. The first run of those happened last summer, and again, with a sprinkling of detects there. Again, nothing that rises off the page as a major alarming factor, but again, it will all be where that bright line is defining what is compliant and what is not. We're also, through our remediation bureau, looking at groundwater, with a look at probable sources where these PFAS compounds might have been collected. Principally among them is firefighting activities, such as at airports or in training centers for our city fire departments, since PFAS was a major part of the firefighting foam used to squelch fires in a variety of those settings, but has also left the legacy of these. Our military installations certainly have been a focus of this, since the military, especially with things such as firefighting foam, utilized those compounds to a great degree, and probably are sitting on top of a fairly significant accumulation of the compounds there. But being the federal government, being military, it is a interesting dance for us to work through to try to determine how big a deal, again, this is for us. Suffice it to say, it's something that's going to force our attention to it, but in the meantime, we have other things to work on and worry about as we work through it. Touch on lead again. The impetus is going to be on the utilities to review their infrastructure, inventory it, and then once they find the lead to, again, proceed to remove it, not just, again, on their side of the meter, but also begin to make inroads into consumers to take, replace some of their premise plumbing to remove lead from that, which is an interesting interaction of government into private property and private lives that will be an interesting effort to see how successful we are in being able to reach into people's homes to help them replace and remove their potential exposure to lead. As I mentioned, PFAS has become the dominant headline over the past year or so and has gained our attention. Number one priority for my clean water side, my wastewater and water quality side has been nutrients. We're an ag state, nutrients are everywhere, and nutrients present major problems for us. We see it manifested in terms of harmful algal blooms in our lakes and reservoirs. Our water supplies see it because of the production of organic matter, and then in the course of disinfection processes create disinfection byproducts that are regulated with maximum contaminant levels and are viewed as potential carcinogens and are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act that the utility needs to have those removed. All that stems from an excess of nutrients present in our surface waters. Even in our groundwaters, nitrate certainly has become a major issue for us to deal with our compliance issues for our public water supplies, and it's expensive to get out. Nutrients, we've been very successful in reducing the output from our cities and industries of nutrients in their wastewater streams through technology and through optimization and training to work those wastewater treatment processes to effectively take out nitrogen and phosphorus down to levels that begin to approach a more pragmatic and realistic level of nutrient input into our surface waters. But again, by our nature, we're a rural state. The predominant source of these nutrients is non-point source, which lies outside the realm of our regulatory reach. They are basically those activities that are not regulated under the Clean Water Act or under the authorities of KDHE. We have to get to them through incentive-based programs to put in conservation practices and treatment practices, ranging from no-till, soil health practices, buffers, et cetera, to try to maintain and keep nutrients in place on site. Not just on the ag side, in the agricultural sector, which is, again, a major feature of our land use, but also within small towns, residential areas, suburbia that has runoff coming off of household yards, et cetera, golf courses. Nutrients are basically one of the fuels that makes life possible. The problem is when it's too excessive, it moves off-site and becomes, extends that productivity and development into well waters that become problematic. Mineralization, many of the committee are aware from the past 2 years issues we've had on the Arkansas River as it comes in from Colorado with high levels of minerals. Principal among them that has gained a lot of attention is uranium, present in the first 3 counties coming along the arc coming in from Colorado, and it's present to a high degree in that lower stretch of the arc within Colorado itself. Some of you attended summit we had, a 3-day summit we had last May with Colorado to begin to attack the issue and address it, as well as for both states and their citizens to engage with one another to understand where the other side was coming from. That effort is ongoing. We'll actually have a call with Colorado this Friday to continue to talk, and we will have another water quality summit in this coming May to again visit some of these areas and talk about the issues and practices that we might bring to bear to stem the influx of those minerals into the Ark River. albeit that the river itself reflects its geologic backstory and certainly has never been what one would call a pristine stream, but it does reflect a lot of anthropogenic impact and influence as a result of the decades-long pattern of how irrigation was conducted on both sides. And that has now created the situations we see at Lakin and Garden City, et cetera. So that effort is ongoing and continues to be that. We are now engaging the federal agencies to begin to see what resources they can bring to bear. We're having conversations with the Natural Resource Conservation Service to move one of their National Water Quality Initiative watersheds over to our portion of the Arkansas River, probably around Lakin, where the irrigation ditches move water from the river and up to the irrigated lands that are covered by those ditch companies. We're also working with NRCS to initiate a RCPP, or Resource Conservation Partnership Program, with Colorado as a bi-state effort to, again, direct federal resources to help bring in practices that will ultimately work to try to stem, again, that tide of influx of minerals that are causing problems on both sides of the state line, but certainly that we've seen within our groundwater that's associated with the Ark River. The Ark River is not unique to us. So up in northwest Kansas, we see some of the same issues relative to mineralization, arsenic, selenium, uranium. Again, for some of the same reasons of the historic geology that underlies the streams out west and the underlying groundwater, as well as the irrigation and water use practices. And we're starting to gather through Fort Hays State information on the extent of that. Mineralization, this state has always been plagued by a high level of minerals present in the water. The Ark River itself, after it disappears at Garden City, reemerges just upstream from Great Bend and begins to course its way toward Wichita, Hutchinson, and Wichita. Once it engages the Rattlesnake Creek, it is hot with chloride, and chloride becomes the predominant issue, characteristic that marks the Ark River as it works its way toward Wichita. It gets diluted out with the influx from the Little Ark watershed, but generally it is characterized as a highly mineralized stream as it courses through the remainder of our state and heads into Kaw Lake in Oklahoma. On the Kansas River, which is fed in part by the Smoky Hill River system, including the Saline and the Solomon, we see chloride issues, especially under these conditions we're seeing now with drought, where high levels of chloride are present there. We mitigate them to a degree with releases from Milford and Tuttle Creek and Perry reservoirs. But an emerging issue there has been bromide. Again, it's been emanating from that Smoky Hill complex of watersheds between the Smoky and the Saline and the Solomon. Introduces bromide into the Kansas River, which in and of itself isn't a problem, except that when it undergoes disinfection by our surface water suppliers, Topeka, Lawrence, and especially Water One, who is trying to utilize an ozone approach for disinfection, that ozone of bromide-laden water creates a disinfection byproduct that is bromide-based, and basically becomes an MCL issue for Water One to try to deal with, which has forced them to utilize their Missouri River intake more so than they perhaps wanted to, and wean off a little bit of their Kansas. The levels in the bromide in the Kansas River are approaching 200 parts per billion. It is something that's emerged in the more recent years, and we're still trying to work with the Kansas Geological Survey to figure out why that is, why it all of a sudden has begun to show up more and more. Part of it could be a unforeseen after impact from the 2019 flood, which supercharged all the streams in their alluviums, and now that we're in drought, those waters now are coming back into the surface water and bringing their mineral content with them. Certified operator program, the biggest issue with that is just workforce attraction and retention. As we get more and more complex issues with our water and wastewater, it takes technology, yes, but it also takes skill, a skilled workforce to be able to make those machines work right. To be able to have and retain a cadre of those types of operators and workers has been an ongoing challenge, particularly for our small towns. Small towns are carrying the brunt of issues relative to compliance, and they are ill-equipped to be able to, first off, pay the capital cost for bringing in the technology that'll fix it, and then paying the operation and maintenance costs, including salaries of their operators there. And we're seeing an erosion and exodus of operators out of the field as we're starting to enter into an intergenerational transition and looking toward what degree we can attract young people to get into the field and carry on the banner of maintaining and providing safe drinking water to the citizens served by our public water supplies and to control the discharge of pollutants into Kansas waters. So it's an ongoing effort to try to work on with that, try to simplify and streamline the testing and certification procedures. But at the end, it's still going to be a matter of where local opportunities are attractive enough to hold on to that talent and keep them in place to maintain these more and more complex systems. Water reuse, a year ago I would have said water reuse is an interesting topic for other states, but it's not for us. I'm wrong. We have two cities, Dodge City and Garden City, that are actively looking at wastewater reuse as a means to extend their water supplies through managed aquifer recharge along the arc and along the alluvium there, and have started to engage us in how to go about that. Garden City got a earmarked allocation from Congress in the December appropriations for $19 million to begin to look at water reuse. Some of that will be utilized for meeting the needs of more and more industries that are showing up in those cities, and some of it is just secure growth of those cities for future generations. Again, because of the condition of the groundwater resources in that part of the state, they're now going to need to become more and more innovative to be able to exercise appropriate conservation, including putting a reuse tactic in their arsenal of how they're going to satisfy their water supply needs for the future. In and of itself, it's a fairly straightforward process, but it will, especially as we engage them in safe drinking water activities and public supplying their public water supply needs, the rigor in which they're going to have to treat is not like anything they've ever seen before. Part of that is to basically ensure that there's no transmission of pathogens from those wastewater source water. And some of it is now because how much of the PFAS issue is going to become a constraint in our ability to reutilize this available resource to repurpose it for subsequent water supply. So these are ongoing challenges. And again, it'll be a function of the rules that EPA establishes when it comes to safe drinking water and the levels of PFAS relative to that. The Arbuckle Formation is one of the lowest, deepest formations we have. It has always been historically viewed as a aquifer with infinite capacity to take waste streams. And from both what are called underground injection control Class 1 facilities, these are essentially energy operations that dispose of brine that is no longer useful for them in maintaining their salt caverns and where they store hydrocarbon product. The city of Hutchinson, through its reverse osmosis process and waste streams coming from that, utilize these deep well injection disposal means to place their waste there and don't send it to the Ark River. Lake in itself, with its issues with uranium, actually the major part of its cost is not so much the treatment as much as the disposal of the residuals that come about because of that treatment, which are sent down a deep well down into the Arbuckle. And the Arbuckle itself is in a very convoluted resource that marks in the far west. It still retains a lot of retention. In the south central area, you know it as one of the causes of the seismic activity that has plagued Reno County and Sedgwick County in the past. And then out east, as we get past Representative Blex's area, it becomes a fresh water supply. The city of Pittsburgh relies on the Arbuckle and the Rubidoux as part of their water supply system. So it's a very complex resource of which we don't actually know a lot about. The conventional wisdom was it is a aquifer that can take all comers. Whatever you've got, send it down to them. Those days are over, not just between our facilities that we regulate, of which there are about 50, spanning from over in the Garden City area up to Deffenbaugh up in Kansas City. But also the myriad of oil and gas activities and what KCC regulates as the Class 2 operations that also utilize these brines for as part of what comes out of their extraction of oil and gas, but also what they utilize in terms of enhanced oil recovery, but ultimately look to dispose of down deep well to the Arbuckle as well. We're seeing, while the public sees the issue as seismic activity, the resource manager sees it as diminished capacity to continue to take these large volumes overall as a means of disposal. Increased borehole pressures and rising static water levels are what we're seeing, and the worry is to not have those static water levels begin to approach where they could engage fresh water supplies such as the aqueous beds or emerge out into the surface and start discharging out into surface areas as well. It is an ongoing effort being championed by the Kansas Water Office, who is working through the Kansas Geological Survey to try to gather the facts. Both the regulatory agencies, KDHE and KCC, are in that conversation as well to try to see what that information can do to help guide us on both our strategies in managing deep well disposal, as well as tactical efforts that we need to always keep in mind to try to diminish, again, what the public has always seen as the issue, which is the seismic activity, which fortunately has diminished quite a bit since the winter of 2020, and we're not seeing much activity in that hot zone of Reno and Sedgwick County in the past couple years. Salt and lying in the ground is a tremendous asset that Kansas is constantly trying to exploit. It has been a major feature of our caverns that have been cut out of that salt. Because of the nature of salt, it's very tight. It serves as basically a solitary vessel that's able to hold on to hydrocarbon products, keep them in place until they're needed for another time. Our underground hydrocarbon storage efforts will begin to manage that overall process. But salt is also now, with new initiatives that are going forth for hydrogen, helium, compressed air, biosolid disposal, and potentially even PFAS is an area of accomplishing that. So we are going to have to be able to manage how salt is utilized here in the state with all these new initiatives coming forth. That concludes what we have here, but the one area that I didn't have on there was WOTUS, Waters of the U.S. Why? Well, to be blunt, we're bored with it. There is nothing for us to do anymore. The federal agencies have made their mind up. They've issued the final rule. We pleaded with them in Office of Management and Budget not to do it. Supreme Court has a case in front of it that can help further define the extent of the question of federal jurisdiction on waters. They went ahead and did it anyway. We predicted it, and it happened. Within the next day, Texas filed suit. North Dakota's following up behind that. We knew it was going to go to litigation. Ultimately, the answer to this is either going to be a definitive Supreme Court ruling, or it's going to be Congress rolling up its sleeves and redefining in specific measures what constitutes waters of the U.S. And it's been framed as a issue of protecting waters. It's not. It's a question of jurisdiction. Where does the federal jurisdiction line stop, and the states assume that? For Kansas, that issue has tended to be relative to ephemeral waters, those waters that only flow next to waters of the in response to rainfall. State law says those are not classified waters, what we would probably refer to as waters of the U.S. And yet we have protections in place to manage and protect any water quality features associated with those predominantly dry streams and so forth. The end game should be a robust process between the state environmental agencies and the federal agencies to make determinations as to what falls within that. For the ag community, the biggest thing they're going to want to look at is what practices or activities are excluded from being covered by this definition and the actions that then trigger permitting. Not so much permitting from KDHE as permitting from the Corps of Engineers, the so-called 404 permits that involve the dredge and fill activities associated with these waters. Wetlands has always been kind of the reason why these issues have come before us. Our wetlands tend to lie on private land and are largely in riparian nature unless we've placed them into a refuge, like a Cheyenne Bottoms or Rivera. That's not the issue. The issue is essentially where is that line going to be drawn, where the federal agencies hand off to the states and say, you handle that type of, manage that type of water. Mr. Chair, I think that's a quick chef's tour of some of the issues confronting us relative to water. I think both Director Henning and I could stand for any questions from the committee.
As the committee's formulating your questions, first I want to apologize for the heat in this room. We just turned the thermostat down half an hour ago, and it should have happened about 4 o'clock this morning and opened the windows, I think. But I want to thank you guys for all the information you've provided this morning. In full disclosure, Director Henning and I have worked together since 1993 on water issues underneath our landfill in my home county. Between you and Tom, how many years' experience do you have at KDHE?
30 and what, 40? So about 70 years.
70 years, okay. Tom gave us a lot of challenges we have here in the state of Kansas. My question is, those have probably always been there. Are our conditions getting worse, or are we getting better at understanding what our challenges are?
I'll start, and I'll let Tom respond also if he wants to. But I think science is driving a lot of this. We are seeing things, like PFAS, for example. That wasn't even on the radar 5 years ago. Toxicity studies, lead is a big issue. It always has been a big issue, but we are seeing an administration that is trying to drive those standards that have been there for years lower and lower and lower. Same with the emissions in the air. We're seeing air emissions being pushed lower and lower and lower. These are all good things. They're good for public health, right? But they all come with a dollar value. And that's the part that sometimes I don't know if is ever contemplated very well. It's great that we have cleaner water, cleaner air, but every time that happens, we just need to realize there's a price tag that comes with it, and are we willing to pay for it or not? May I make 1 or 2 comments here to wrap up? Our discussion here today, we broke up the bureaus by the federal laws and the way we are organized. The one thing I want to talk to this committee about is these programs do not sit at KDHE in individual areas. They do geographically, but the amount of interaction between the bureaus when a subject comes up is incredible, and I don't think people realize how much interaction there is within the different programs. So, and I'm just going to use an example here really quick. I have a whole list of things to talk about, but I know we're stretched for time. But I'm going to use the Panasonic facility that's being built over in DeSoto as an example of the coordination that occurs within KDHE. And it's just not Panasonic. Any company that comes to the state really does appreciate the fact that all the environmental permitting is in one place. They don't have to go over here for one permit and over here for another one. And the fact that we are all together, we help coordinate those activities. But for the Panasonic site, just an idea of the environmental permits that were required or will be required. First, to start the construction out there, to do the leveling, they have to do a construction stormwater permit to make sure that sediment controls are in place. Next thing, since there was a small intermittent stream that was impacted by the footprint of the building, they have to get a 401 permit from the Corps of Engineers, and our Bureau of Environmental Field Services helps coordinate that so that that impact of that stream is mitigated. Next, the site was an old Army base that was contaminated. So our Bureau of Environmental Remediation had to go in, make sure that the Army cleaned it up in such a manner that we could have a safe place to build a facility there. There's a RCRA permit on the facility because they had so much hazardous waste, the Army had so much hazardous waste out there that there's a RCRA permit, and as these properties get cleaned up, that has to come off of the RCRA permit. So that coordination between the cleanup folks and BER and the RCRA folks and waste management, it's a daily interaction. The next thing is this facility is going to have air emissions. It's a battery plant, they're going to have air emissions. That is where they get their air permit from the Bureau of Air. And then finally, there's going to be a waste stream that comes out of this facility, whether it's a hazardous waste or even just the water waste that comes out of the facility. That has to be coordinated with our Bureau of Water, and then hazardous waste if there is one. And then the interaction between us and the city of DeSoto, who's actually going to take that water to figure out, okay, is it going to require pretreatment at the facility, or can the facility take it? Will the facility have to become larger to take all this additional waste? So those interactions and that play between all the different bureaus happens on a daily basis. And that coordination is for any, I would say, any industry in the state, they do appreciate the fact that it is all in one spot. So with that, I'll be quiet.
Questions? Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Leo and Tom. I always learn something new when I hear from you all. I just have a couple of questions. So in regards to PFAS, I was curious, are there other countries that have dealt with this? Is this something that's entirely new overall? It's something that I've heard a lot about, and I'm broadly curious. I know there are concerns about ultimately treating it, but are there countries who are doing this as well?
That is a good question, because I've not really followed up on the world PFAS discussions. I don't really know how to answer that question. Europe is usually, and the United States are usually pretty in tune with each other as far as initiatives around a chemical like this. So I would assume that they are on board and doing the same type of things. But most of the industrialized countries understand PFAS, But like I said, 5 years ago, we weren't even talking about PFAS. It wasn't an issue, but since the tox studies come out showing that there could be a carcinogen, and we know that it's in so many of our day-to-day materials, it's becoming an issue. So how we deal with it is what we're waiting to see from EPA at what levels, because some of the levels that they are proposing are less than what we can detect in our instruments. We're talking about parts per quadrillion. And, it used to be we measured things in parts per million, then it went to parts per billion. Now we're down to parts per quadrillion, which is, to me, as an old guy, kind of scary, but, but, you know, we can get pretty low, but it'll be it'll be a new world once they set those standards.
Quick follow-up to the PFAS. Do you know, does it accumulate? I know it accumulates in the bloodstream, but is it something, for example, that could be passed on from a mother to a child? Or is there any research on that?
It does concentrate in milk. We know that. So that would probably happen. It does concentrate. It is a bioaccumulator. That's why we see it in fish tissue, bioaccumulating, it's a way of just concentrating in your body. Those things, yeah, it is a bioaccumulator.
Yeah, that's really frightening, but I appreciate the update on that. One other thing that I've kind of been wondering about, and we've talked about this a little bit, and you alluded to it in your presentation, but curious for small communities who are dealing with the need to update their public water supply systems. What challenges are they facing? Is it a lack of funding? What hand does your department have in helping them come into compliance? Would you mind painting a little bit of a picture of that for us?
Yeah. How much time do we have?
You have 22 and a half minutes, sir.
Oh, okay, great. Well then, I thought we were over at 10, and I thought I was running up against a wall. Okay, so, long story here. The bipartisan infrastructure money that came down, a lot of people have thought, oh, this is going to solve a lot of our problems for the small facilities, because there is a forgiveness portion to those grants, and we can then just give those to those people. It doesn't really work that way. And again, the BIL money is loans. So the small communities, even with forgiveness, could not pay back the loans. And we, as a loaning entity, and I hate to sound like a bank, but on the other hand, we can't give out bad loans. We cannot loan money to a small community that we know cannot afford it. So, or if they do try to afford it, the residents within that city would probably leave because their water bills are so astronomical they can move to the next town and not pay those. So that's the issue. There is no money to help the smaller communities that are having water compliance problems, and they are stuck. What we have been able to do is we were able to, in this last round of Spark funding, get $10 million for our Water Bureau to issue grants, non-payable money to those small communities. $10 million sounds like a lot. That $10 million will be gone in no time. There are so many small communities that need to upgrade their infrastructures that I expect that $10 million is going to go immediately. So there is a funding problem. These small communities, if we want to keep them viable and keep them there, we're going to have to find some way to provide them funding to upgrade their facilities, because ultimately what will happen is what happened in a small town some of you may have heard of is Pretty Prairie, Kansas, where we tried to give the city a lot of leniency to come into compliance with the drinking water standards. EPA said, you're taking way too much time. We're going to help you, the city, come into compliance. And they basically wrote them an order and said, you're going to come into compliance. And the city ended up having to spend $2 million on a treatment plant. And so those are the things that ultimately happen. There is a federal standard out there. You have to meet that federal standard. And although we try to be as cooperative as we can with these small communities, there will become a point where enforcement will be in action, and it will be a sad day for those communities.
And if I can follow up on that, I know too, it's a struggle for the cost for small communities for systems like reverse osmosis and these things that cost millions of dollars, and they have to divide that cost between 500, 1,000 members of the community. And I know it becomes really difficult to pay that back. So I think it's definitely a place the state should be paying more attention to and helping communities where we can.
And not only do you have the initial cost of the treatment, but the operation and maintenance of that system, and then the issue that Tom brought up, having certified operators to now run a very complicated system in a small town, it's all a concern, yes.
Thank you.
Representative Cywert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure listening to you. I don't know how you keep track of everything you do because it's really complicated. And being from Pretty Prairie, we're one of the first ones in the country to have a point source of pollution. A lot of coffee talks I got to, they asked me questions. Maybe you can help me answer. Most of these things all came out of the ground. We use them and then put them back in the ground. Why are they contaminated now when they were, like Hutchinson, the salt mines are right there, if you remember Caryville. How do I answer that question to them? Because those products were all in the ground, oil or whatever, but now they contaminate. What makes them contaminate us? Breaking them apart or what? How do I answer that?
I'm going to answer that very generally, and then if you want to get into specifics, we can, but and I'll use the salt as an example. The salt that they mine in Hutchinson is below the drinking water formation, right? It's several hundred, maybe 1,000 feet below it. And there was a cap above that salt that did not allow that chloride in that salt to percolate up into the drinking water. Soon as we mine that salt out, bring it to the surface, and use it for whatever purpose that we were using it for, whether we throw it on the streets to melt ice or whatever, it now has the ability to percolate back into the drinking water source. And in Hutchinson it is a very sandy soil. It is also a very shallow groundwater. So it doesn't take a whole lot of effort for that salt to percolate down into that drinking water source, and now it is contaminating our drinking water.
Representative Blex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Leo and Tom, for always a fine, outstanding program. My question to you, and I'm sure a lot of legislatures get this, is the moving target issue. A good example would be Caney, and this is primarily EPA doing this, of coming in 15 years ago and tearing up or removing lead from yards and meeting the standard of that time, and now they're going to do it again. And this really torques people off to have the standard lowered and meet the standard, and then all of a sudden this moving target, and I constantly get complaints about that. I guess my question to you is, and maybe I know part of the answer, but not all of it, how much interaction does this, at the state level, do the respective agencies that are charged with the enforcement have in negotiation or conversation with the feds on those standards?
We can provide comments on.
But you got to have them listen to you, correct?
We can provide comments, and they take them into consideration, and then they set the standard. And especially for lead, we talked about it several times here. There's a large outcry from the Flint, Michigan issue that occurred to drive lead numbers down, whether it's in the soil, residential yards, whether it's in our drinking water, whether it's in our surface water. There's just a general push to drive lead down. And from a health perspective, there's no good concentration of lead that we should be intaking, right? We get nothing out of lead. It's not good for us. But again, like I mentioned earlier, every one of these things cost money. Every time we set a new standard for a lower number, they cost money. And that's the part that sometimes I don't know if completely understood when those standards are set.
Thank you for that.
Representative Cywert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for a second time. So what we're talking about, just like you said, Pretty Prairie, you know very well that there's a lot of concern that all these chemicals we're using, and I was a no-till farmer since the mid-90s, pioneering in that. Is there any fear that just what you said of us putting all them chemicals on this ground Is that going to, in 10 years, are we going to look up like one of those TV attorneys on night about people that mow their grass that put Roundup on it? Are we going to be liable for that, or is that going to get in our groundwater? Because that seems to be a concern, you know. What's your point, what's your idea on that? Thank you.
Well, I don't think we'll ever outlaw farming. How's that? Farming is a part of, we need farming. We got to have farming. We all like to eat every night. But we are seeing impacts from farming practices, especially in south central Kansas, where I explained shallow water, sandy soils, of the fertilizer and that was placed on those fields, maybe not always at appropriate times and at appropriate concentrations. But even if they were, they still have the ability to leach down into the groundwater, and then municipalities that use that groundwater for drinking water run up against the nitrate standard, and therefore they end up, like Pretty Prairie, having to put on a reverse osmosis system to provide water to their citizens that meet the federal standards. So I hope I answered your question, but it is a concern, and we're seeing it all over the state. High nitrates in
Can I
groundwater
ask a
is,
follow-up? I understand on the nitrates. I'm talking about the herbicides that we're putting on now. And we were custom applicators, and we started in the 90s. You only needed 16 ounces of Roundup. Now you're putting on 50 to 60 to do the same thing, and that seems pretty excessive. That was, you know, is this going to be a follow-up of the nitrates?
it's an interesting question. I would say that you are protected as long as you are putting those chemicals on the field at labeled concentrations. There is a protection for the applicators, right? As long as you're not over-applying. Is it impacting our streams? Sure. We're seeing Roundup in our streams, in the sediments, in the water column. That's why implementing some BMPs to keep what's on the field in the field is the direction we need to be going. The more we can keep on the field and out of the streams, the better off as a culture we will be.
Thank you.
One more question quickly, Representative Ron.
Thank you. I did have one final question, and I don't want to take up too much of the committee's time, but one thing we didn't really talk about today that I'm interested to get an update on is the Keystone oil spill in Mill Creek. And I had read an article stating that most of the, if I'm not mistaken, most of the contaminant had been removed at this point, but just broadly interested if the cause has been identified, what the cleanup techniques are, and if there's any concern about any dilbit that has sunk into the stream bed. Thank you.
I can provide a short update on the Keystone pipeline break. I think most of you heard that there's about 14,000 barrels of oil that left the pipeline, and the stream was very close to it, and it ran right into the stream. And really, the county emergency folks up there did a great job of getting a dam put in to keep the oil in that first 4 miles of stream. They did a great job up there in a middle of the night type thing. So kudos is to the emergency management folks up there. So recovery efforts, you know, it is a thick oil. It's a tar oil from Canada. It went into the water. Because of its viscosity, it's a little harder to get up. So, but the status is that probably most of the oil is off of the top of the water. There's small pockets of oil left, but most of it, and I'm going to say 99.9% of the oil is off the top of the water. We still have a concern that there may be oil that has sunk because of its viscosity, and it's a heavy crude that if it mixes with a little bit of dirt, it becomes a little heavier and it will go down to the bottom. So those assessments are going to be starting here very shortly. We couldn't really do those when you got a foot of oil on the top of the water to start looking at what's below the water. But now that the oil is pretty much gone, we can start doing those assessments. As far as what caused it, we still don't know. They sent the pipe off to some facility in Texas to see if it was a metallurgical problem, and I have not heard the results of that. But I don't know if we will ever exactly know what the cause was. It wasn't the weld. I don't think it was the pipe. It just split for some reason. And there's a lot of discussion about why. I don't know, I have not heard TC, Trans-Canada, really come out and say, oh, this is exactly what the reason was. They have ideas, they think, but they don't really have proof of knowing exactly what caused it.
Thank you for the update. Yeah, I would like to push, and I will reach out to TC Energy, but all involved parties to come forth with some sort of cause determination, just because I do think it's important for us to make sure this doesn't happen again. And I think knowing what caused it is essential to that. So I appreciate the update, and we can talk offline too, but wanted to provide that info to the committee.
We've asked that, right? We are still asking what caused it. They just don't have an answer yet.
Got it. Thank you.
Because like you, we don't want to see another one of these in our state again.
Last question to Representative Titus.
Thank you for being so gracious, Mr. Chairman. Just very quickly, it was my understanding early on in the cleanup, everyone felt pretty good that there wouldn't be any impact on the Little Blue or the Big Blue downstream because of where it occurred and everything that was taken. I just wanted to confirm that's still the consensus opinion.
We were sampling the water out there in Mill Creek and then into the Small Blue. There were some petroleum contaminants in the water. Were they at concentrations high enough to cause damage? We don't think so. But there was impacts. There was some of the petroleum chemicals that we did detect all the way through from the spill to the mouth of the Little Blue and then down the Little Blue a ways. But we don't think they're at concentrations that would cause harm.
I assume that monitoring will continue.
And we are still continuing to monitor the site, and the numbers have dropped off significantly now.
Thank you, Leo and Tom. That was a lot of information in a short time period. I appreciate it. I'm sure you'd be available if the members have further questions. Committee, I was negligent in asking for approval of our last 3 meetings minutes. I'm sure you've read through the 19th, 24th, and 26th minutes. Can I have a motion for approval? Representative Blex? Representative Getz, second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Motion carries. I want to give everybody a small amount of homework. I'm going to ask you to go home and report back to us in about a week what your particular community's water consumption is. I'm interested in municipal water use also. Over the weekend, I gathered mine in my home community, and I'll give you a sample of what I expect from a report from you. In Scott City, in 2022, they utilized 371,240,000 gallons of water. In a population of 4,100 people in that community, that's 1,017,096 gallons per day, or by doing the math, 248 gallons per day per person. I'm amazed that the city of Hayes can have habitants there and their water utilization is 97 gallons per person per day. And my home community is at 248. I think we can do better. Honestly, with the smaller population back in 2002, they utilized 440 million gallons, or 70 million gallons more than we did this last year in 22. I'm assuming a lot of that went on some green grass lawns and everything else. We do take lots of showers in Scott City, but I don't think that's the full attribution to it. But if you guys would do a little research for me and come back on Thursday, we have several conservation groups that are going to speak to us, and we're going to have a presentation from the Water Office on the reservoir funding that day also. And next week, we're going to have a presentation from the Municipal Utilities Group. And when they're talking, I'd like you guys to have your own information in front of you about your own communities. I'd appreciate it. Is there anything else for the benefit of the community?
Just a reminder, we're going to tour Water One on February 17th. So just save that date. I'll be emailing the details. I just received them. So.
Anything else? We are adjourned.